Hi, everyone. Welcome back. I hope you all had a nice lunch break. The policy panel will begin shortly. I did want to note that one of our panelists, Deborah Santiago, had an emergency situation and will likely not be able to join us today. But I am delighted to welcome the rest of the panel. So just a quick note, during this session, we invite you to place questions for the panelists in the Q&A chat box. The panelists have reviewed the questions you submitted during registration and have prepared some topics in advance. They will address additional questions at the end of their discussion as time allows. So with that, I'll say a huge thank you to our panelists for participating in today's conversation, and I'll now turn things over to our facilitator, Joel Vargas, to begin the discussion.
Thanks so much, Emily. Really excited to be here. On behalf of all the panelists, I want to thank you and the conference organizers, North Carolina Community Colleges, RAND, the Early College Research Center, and the Department of Public Instruction in North Carolina for this opportunity. And I'm thrilled to be joined by a great panel. We'll miss Deborah, but we have a good lineup here, as I think you'll see, and I know we have a great group of participants, and looking forward to engaging with you in the Q&A chat. What I'll say is you have their bios, so I'm not going to do formal introductions, but they have a great range and variety of perspectives on policy from the local, national, federal, and state lenses, and then also really understanding how policy intersects with practice. So just I think that the conference organizers did an outstanding job pulling us together. Really appreciate it, and I'm looking forward to participating and mixing it up as well with our panelists. So let me just start. We saw your questions, as Emily said, and I think we kind of landed on three big areas that we thought might be a good way to encompass your addressing your questions. One which I'm going to speak to a bit is just a little bit about purpose, because it connects with the equity conversation and equitable access and success with populations, and then also kind of looking over the horizon at the future of dual enrollment and what this may be all leading to for our education systems. I'll tell a little quick story here before I turn it over to our panelists, and that's as I prepared for this, I was sort of thinking to myself, this is so exciting that there is such a growing field, and this conference and its success and the level of participation is just one indication of that growing field. And it's just heartening to see that so many people are interested in dual enrollment and having it fulfill its promise to young people in the country. And when I started at Jobs for the Future over 20 years ago, I feel like dual enrollment, at least to me, felt like this kind of obscure activity, and there were a set of associated policies around it, and that I only got to know because it was really my job at the time when I joined the organization to understand the state and federal policies that could enable the growth of early college high schools, which I trust you all know, having participated in this conference and also given your interest in this topic. And through that role and that job, I came to understand that dual enrollment was a key, though not the only one, but a key policy lever, both an enabler or blocker of those schools. And to the degree that it was a blocker, it was often because a lot of the policies in dual enrollment were set up to provide access. I think it's fair to say it was trying to provide access to advanced courses for gifted and talented, quote unquote, students who'd maxed out their high school curriculum, or to enable rural students by the same token to have access. And in contrast, the purpose of early college high schools, as you know, is to enable students to graduate high school who traditionally graduate at lower rates, who attended and completed college at lower rates, and give them a chance to change that situation by taking some college coursework early with support as a way to raise their educational attainment and achievement. And I won't go into the weeds of what this looks like, but those purposes were at cross purposes, and the policies reflected it. And in the intervening years, I'd say more and more positive research emerged about the positive effects of early college and dual enrollment programs on education outcomes for students, including those from low income backgrounds and Black and Latina and Latino students. And as that research emerged, more and more policymakers became interested in shifting their dual enrollment policies to be designed more explicitly with the purpose of reaching those populations. So I would say as a result of that interest, access has grown astronomically to dual enrollment. And yet, we know that dual enrollment is still not fully realizing its potential because it's still not equitably reaching all groups of students, especially those who are underserved by our systems, who could really be helped the most. The research suggests, right, through well-designed programming. So our panelists we're going to spend a bit of time on this. Saw the energy from the questions that were submitted in advance. We're going to really focus on the opportunities for and limitations of policy to change the situation, to make it more equitable, to help dual enrollment realize its full potential. And they're also going to do, as I said earlier, a little look over the horizon at the implications of dual enrollment and its continued growth. So what I'll do is kind of the rhythm of this is I'll ask a couple of pointed questions to specific panelists to kick off the discussion and then invite others to join in. And then I'm also going to invite you who are participating to put in questions, comments in the Q&A section of this webinar. And we'll try to track with that. And we may even, I think we'll try to keep this conversational. As questions come up, we'll try to address them maybe in real time. Certainly we'll leave some time at the end to address some of those, but love to keep this in a more natural flow if possible. I'm going to start first with Alex Perry. Alex, I want to ask you if you could help us do a little level setting, which is important when we talk about policy. I know it seems a little elementary, but I think it's important to level set with everyone. Like, how would you define policy? Does it just mean legislation? What are we talking about here? And what's important to understand about how policy is operationalized?
Yeah, this is a super great question, Joel. Thank you so much. And thank you, everybody, for being here. I really appreciate it. I think about policy really broadly. The beginning of my career was as an advocate. My sort of came from the advocacy world. And one of the sort of biggest ways that I kind of think about this is, okay, if we have a goal, there are lots of different ways of accomplishing that goal. And just in the same way that there are lots of different ways of accomplishing that goal, there are lots of different ways through policy to achieve any ends that we want. Legislation is one of those ways, but only one of those ways, right? When we think about, the way that I sort of define policy is like, how are we at a more than an individual program level having a conversation and engaged in a sustained effort to, across whatever sort of level of system it is we're looking at, if it's more than one, engaged in that effort to achieve the ends that we have set out and doing it in some degree of systematic way. Now, as I say, that can be through statewide legislation, right? That's the one thing that people automatically sort of reach to as like the most obvious answer to that question. But I think it's really important to say, obviously, we recognize politics is really hard. And as a result, policy is really hard as well. And because it's really hard, I think it's really important for us to conceptualize, if we have goals and we feel really strongly about those goals, the things we want to do, right? Policy is a way of doing something. It's not, right, like that is what it should be, right? It should be, we have something that we want to accomplish, and policy is the mechanism through which we accomplish that thing. But there are lots of different mechanisms available to us in how to do that. So when I think about policy, yes, it means legislation. Yes, it means regulation. Yes, it means the provision of funding. But to me, it also means things like providing guidance. It means things like creating communities of practice. It means things like providing technical assistance, right? As long as we're thinking about them at a systems level, and even that doesn't necessarily have to be just at a state level or just at a national level. That could be at a regional level. It could be at a local level. As long as we're impacting more than one program by doing it, and as long as we're thinking about what do we want and what are we trying to accomplish, and then we're identifying the mechanism by which we believe it's possible for us to accomplish that, that to me is policy right there. That's the world of how are we actioning on the goals that we have and ultimately achieving them, given all of the constraints that exist within our universe, because there are policy constraints, there are political constraints, there are funding constraints, there are cultural constraints. And so a lot of this comes down to, okay, within all this alchemy of you want to do this thing, you're here and you want to get here, and there are all these roadblocks in between how you get there. Policy and the policy that you choose is the way that you ultimately navigate between the two.
Appreciate that perspective, Alex, and I think it's a great warm up to everything else we're going to discuss here. And you know, I want to turn to the equity conversation explicitly now, and you know, just again teeing us up. Research shows that dual enrollment really does, you know, have positive impacts on underserved populations when we design it well. But in general, it's growing inequitably. And I wanted to turn to Nadia because, you know, in Nadia, in many ways, you're sitting at the intersection of policy and practice. If I understand, maybe you can explain, you know, start out your answer to the question by explaining a little bit more your role for folks who may not be as familiar with the work in Ohio. And I just wanted to ask you, like, from your experience, how can policy address equity challenges in dual enrollment from your experience? And, you know, do you think it can solve it? Does it perpetuate inequities, or are there other levers we need to use, et cetera? But I would love to hear your thoughts on this.
Great, thank you so much. Yeah, I wrote some notes, and Alex, I appreciate your comments too. I'm jotting down things because I think it's so great to bounce the ideas and really collaborate with all of each other. I've been able to sit on some of the sessions for this conference as well, and have been really pleased and energized to move kind of forward. Yeah, so to answer your questions, maybe, yes, no, yeah, right? So in Ohio, Ohio has legislated, so there is a statewide policy legislation for dual enrollment with the creation of College Credit Plus. And so in Ohio, all public secondary and post-secondary institutions are required to participate. So in a way, our state has said, yeah, everyone's going to do this, right? And you're going to be required to do it. And here are all the requirements that all of you must do, some at the secondary level, some at the post-secondary level. And as expected, it's not been equitable, right? So some students have really succeeded, and those students that were going to attend college anyway have benefited very greatly and are moving on. And as we are now in the, let's see, it started 16, so gosh, we're moving on 8 years now in College Credit Plus. We're trying to catch up and say, okay, how do we make sure that this is benefiting all of our students in the state? And while our initial policy to get everyone involved and having it be free was fantastic, why is it that many of our underserved students are still not participating? So yeah, being free is cost a barrier? Is that something that legislation and policy can address? Absolutely. But addressing that alone, in our case, still wasn't making the difference, right, for the jump in equity and equitable participation. Ohio also put into policy, into legislation, the admission requirements for College Credit Plus. And this is where it has really hindered participation by all, because initially it was based on test scores, right? And so we know that certain populations of students are not going to test as well as others. And by setting that as the only or the main way to participate in this free program, really put a certain population of students able to participate and others not. And so as College Credit Plus grew, and as certainly as a community college, as we came forward and said, hey, listen, we don't even have, test scores required for entry into our institution. And now you're saying we have to have this higher admission standard for our dual enrollment students and our traditional students. And what is a different way that we can get at these groups? How can we use policy to open this up to more students? And so we've been lucky in that the state has heard us, and we've been able to work through the innovative waiver process, where colleges can apply to have those admission requirements waived for students. And so we are able to target specific populations of students, waive those admission requirements, but also provide those wraparound services, because of course you don't want to set a student up for failure if they don't have the background, or if they're truly not prepared. But we know at LCCC, at Lorraine County Community College in Ohio, that students taking even one college course while they're still in high school significantly increases the chance that they will enroll and complete college upon graduation. So we think it's that important to be able to waive those requirements, get them in even one class, give students those extra wraparound services, give them the supports that we know that they'll be able to succeed. And then that helps the more students participating, especially those in the underserved, under-resourced populations. Other levers I think we can use, policy is the mechanism. It's the way of doing things. The state has required certain things. And so I think there's policy. Are you doing the very minimum? Are schools getting away with, oh, well, it's law that I give this information session, but I'll publicize it by putting a Post-it note on my door, and then only the students that are really interested will see it, right? So how can we as institutions make it our policy that we're going to reach out to all students, that we're going to make recommendations, that we're not just going to have students self-identify who they think should be a part of this? How can we use our partnerships with schools to make sure we're getting all of those students involved, that we're getting out to families, that we're doing more than just the minimum to recruit students in the program, and then also get them to take those courses by doing things like embedding courses in the high school, making sure that teachers at those local high schools have those appropriate credentials. So Ohio has had some statewide grants where teachers are able to apply and earn stipends to pay for that graduate level coursework. But as an institution, we implemented that as well and said, hey, we want you to become credentialed. We want you to teach our courses at your school, because we know your students aren't going to be able to get out to our campus. And maybe their internet is not good. And so an online class is not it. And we know that they'll have those extra supports in place at the high school. So what can we do in partnership with your district to get your teachers credentialed, to get those courses at your high school, and to raise that rate of attainment of those College Credit Plus classes?
Thanks for that, Nadia. I'm going to come back to a couple of the threads that you mentioned a little bit, but for now, I want Tim to have a chance to weigh in here. Tim, I want to invite you in here. How do you think of the role of policy here? Especially, some of the things Nadia was describing, policy, the way I interpret it is sometimes it's, policy is blunt, right? And it's like lowest common denominator, if you will. Sorry to use, there are probably more positive connotations here that I can use, but you get my drift. And then, a lot of the other stuff, you get what's needed, like culturally responsive practices, really targeting students who are underserved. That kind of gets down to more of a practice level, or I don't know, I argue you could develop some policies that would encourage that as well. But how do you think about this in the role of policy, Tim? What are you seeing in Washington trying to do?
Well, thank you, Joel, and thank you for putting me third after all of the great ideas have already been have already been presented. I think everything that Alex and Nadia said was spot on. The thing that resonated for me as Alex was speaking was that there are so many policies that are tangential to dual credit or dual enrollment specifically, and those are some of the ones that then Nadia went on to touch on, so thank you. But things like accreditation standards and instructor certification, fiscal policy, how you drive your funding to the places it's most needed. Here in Washington, we're a bit of an anomaly or an enigma because we have a very robust and extensive dual credit program that's exceedingly well financed, but we have virtually no central authority that guides practice. We have me on the K-12 side managing the schools and the districts, all the LEAs, and then post-secondary by and large offers the actual content. And so it's a lot of informal collaboration that goes along with that. And policy is a really tough nut to crack because you are working, whether intentionally or unintentionally, in your silos with your own stakeholders and trying to find that unified guiding message, that North Star between two systems that oftentimes have different priorities is challenging. So that brings us back often to legislation. And as Alex aptly said, legislation is not the only form of policy. But here in Washington, it's gone a long ways towards trying to address some of the equity gaps that we've seen in dual credit. One of those policies is academic acceleration. That may be common in other states, but here in Washington, last year was the first year that every district in the state was required to adopt an academic acceleration policy by which students who meet certain thresholds in their ELA and math and science state standards automatically get enrolled into the next most rigorous course available. They have an opportunity to opt out of that if it's not aligned with their high school and beyond plan. But as a matter of practice and policy, students are to be put into the next most rigorous course. Naturally, those are often dual credit courses. So we've seen, we're still, because last year was the first year that was fully implemented, we're still waiting to see the results on that. But I think that was a very promising practice that we've legislated here in the state. Along with that, we have a statewide requirement that each student have a high school and beyond plan. And the legislature has taken it a step further this year to requiring the adoption of a singular statewide platform for that. And the high school and beyond plan is robust. I mean, it details the students' career goals, their career assessments and inventories, their test scores, their grades, and expects that high school counselors will utilize that to develop their pathway. Now, previously that was very inequitable because of capacity and resources. Some were doing it with spreadsheets, some were doing it in homegrown systems, and others were licensing for those products. And so this last year, we're actually in the process now of soliciting vendors for a statewide platform that will be rolled out and utilized consistently to improve that. So again, these aren't necessarily dual credit policies or dual credit practices, but they connect. And dual credit, for instance, is embedded in the high school and beyond plan, and of course the academic acceleration policies. But again, going back to Alex and Nadia, both of them talked about your gatekeeping, right, around college admissions practices. Your gatekeeping even at the K-12 level as to who is most appropriate to take dual credit coursework, and trying to break down and demystify those things. Another thing that's going through the legislature right now is House Bill, of course, I'm in a space on it right now, 1146, which is requires all school districts to provide annual notification in advance of course scheduling of all dual credit opportunities available to students, the financial aid that is associated with those, which at this point is minimal because I can come back to this. We've essentially fully funded dual credit in Washington at this point. But and then finally, a notification that students may need to take extra steps to have credits transcribed, because one of the big areas that we have seen hindering dual credit, not just dual credit participation, but the applicability of those credits, is that students don't often know that they have earned dual credit, how to transcribe those dual credits, how to find the credits that they have earned, because they oftentimes are working through various different colleges. So that's going to be embedded in that notification as well. I feel like I've spoken a lot, so I'll pause. But I have plenty more to share as we move on to other questions.
Giving us a lot to chew on, Tim. This is terrific. I want to invite Alex back in here for some reactions. Alex, and in terms of, again, with thinking about equity as a goal here, how do you think about policy and maybe some of the more promising policies around the country that seem to aim at this goal?
Yeah, I think sort of part of what we've heard from both Nadia and from Tim is the importance of policy systems rather than individual policies, right? Like the way I sort of think about it is, if this is a 100-meter track and students are trying to run down that track, there are a number of hurdles on that track right now that prevent them from reaching the finish line. And cost might be one, a lack of available credentialed teachers might be another, eligibility requirements might be a third, gatekeepers might be a fourth. And as we take those hurdles away, many of them require their own bespoke policy solutions, right? Like addressing instructor credentialing challenges is a huge challenge and has its own set of things that are needed in order to do that, versus addressing textbook costs for students, versus addressing eligibility criteria. And so as we invest in sort of taking these hurdles off of the track, well, in some cases, we've just taken one hurdle off the track, right? Like, I think there was this effort in the 2010s, which was very noble and very needed and an important part of doing this, that was sort of like, if we just make this free, we will solve all of the problems connected to access. And so there was this massive investment of time and resources into making it free for students to take, in some cases, in some states, as many courses as they wanted to, 100% free of charge. And in some states, completely funded by the state, right? Like many states do require the sort of districts or the colleges sort of pay out of their own pocket in order to offer these courses. But I'm talking about states, Ohio is one of those, right? But I'm talking about states where where like Georgia, for example, where they had specific state investments into providing as many dual enrollment courses for students as they wanted to. And when you look at the sort of success of that, lots of students took lots of dual enrollment, many more than they thought. They, in terms of sheer enrollment numbers, absolutely blew it out of the water in terms of expansion of dual enrollment, made very little progress on closing access gaps. And part of that is because, okay, yeah, we've made it free. But if the high school doesn't have credentialed teachers to teach the courses, a free course is of no value to those students because there is no course for them to take. Or if the eligibility criteria statewide are so high that they lock out student access, that's a real problem. So I think the important thing to talk about here is, what are the policy systems that states, systems, regions are putting into place to think about this as sort of holistically across all of the different challenges and find out ways to address them. It kind of sucks. I find myself doing this a lot where I'm like, wow, you know how difficult that one problem is? Well, guess what? Now you have to tackle all five at the same time. Because that's a hard thing to hear, right? Because it's like, well, this one thing is the work of a career to solve, and you're telling me it's not going to have any impact unless I solve these four other things. And it's like, yeah, unfortunately, that kind of probably is true, right? Like you do sort of need to do that. In terms of things happening in across the country that are really sort of positive, obviously all of the work that Tim talked about in Washington, right, this past year, sort of having made now, these experiences not just completely free for students, but funded to sort of encourage the, you know, the dual credit programs in the state to offer them. That academic acceleration policy was the first in the nation to do that. The automatic acceleration policy. In Texas this past year, we saw them pass a new program that funds low-income student access to dual credit. Basically, as community colleges enroll more low-income students, they get paid more by the state to incentivize enrollment of low-income students. That's the FAST program that was just created this past legislative session. We've seen efforts. Florida, by law, has made has sort of removed textbook costs from students participating in dual enrollment. The caveat being they have sort of passed that cost on to the districts by law rather than having created any bespoke funding to do so. But like, just from a pure equity perspective of textbook costs can be a real barrier for students to participate. Those are now gone in the state of Florida, right? It's not maybe not the sort of whole answer to the question, but it's an important answer to the question in terms of if we really want to improve student access and success to these programs. We're seeing a number of states. I know Illinois passed something like this. Arizona's passed something like this, clarifying the importance of students with disabilities participating in dual enrollment and the importance of programs thinking really seriously about how do we get students with disabilities into these programs? What does that mean in terms of those students' IEPs or 504 plans? And sort of clarifying that there is a space for these students within dual enrollment. We do want them to be there. So there's lots happening all across the country, really designed to sort of think about this. States that have put money on the table. Ohio re-upped their program last year. Louisiana did one the year before to pay for new for graduate credits for teachers to get the 18 credit hours to teach these courses. So there's a ton of really important stuff happening. And as that work happens, just come back to the original point, it's really important to then say, all right, well, if we're making money available for teachers to get graduate credits, what are we doing about statewide eligibility criteria? As we're looking at statewide eligibility criteria, what are we doing about textbook costs? As we're looking at textbook costs, what are we doing about student support mechanisms? I would say that's the sort of positive story. The like piece that we still really need to figure out is counseling and advising, right? So critically important for students. This is a very complex system. It's a very complex set of options that students have access to just within the dual enrollment world, but we know students have access to a lot more than that, right? AP, IB, CLEP, Cambridge, CTE courses, work-based learning experiences, all of the sort of like complete panoply of pathways, opportunities that we want students to have access to. They need help in terms of figuring out how to navigate them. The less help they get, the more it is that only high-resourced students with high-resource families are able to navigate those systems. And I think that's a real pressure point where, from a policy perspective, we really have not done much to think about, like, how do we support that, right? How do we support high-quality counseling and advising? The answer is almost certainly a lot more money than we've provided up until this point to do that. But I think there are also really interesting questions about, like, how do we structure those services? What do they look like? How do we think about the sort of counseling and advising workforce? And what degree of ability do they have to focus on college and career readiness activities, given how increasingly important they are for post-secondary transitions? So that, thinking about intentional dual enrollment, and honestly just like thinking about what are we all doing here, right? Like, what's the really clear vision behind this work and behind the goals of dual enrollment and what we want to accomplish? So lots of work happening, lots of work underway, but the importance overall of thinking about it as part of a holistic system.
Yep. Really appreciate that perspective from all the panelists here. Nadia, I'm going to give you one more bite at the apple here in this part of the conversation, because I heard some things, and it relates to a question that I see Julie, hey Julie, put into the Q&A, and I invite others to come in as well. You know, a lot of the things you spoke to is like, you can have the policies right, but you know, the culture eats policy for lunch. Sort of, you know, saying that we have, which is so true, right? Not to mention some of these other issues that Tim and Alex have brought up. Tim spoke eloquently about, like, some of the capacity issues and multiple human resources, technology, just all. Want to hear from your perspective, like, what are things that you're doing in Ohio, or that you've seen, you know, that have promised to kind of address inequities more holistically? even if not necessarily in policy per se. And maybe one of the areas would be high quality advising.
Thanks. Yeah, I saw that in the chat, and I'm laughing because I'm thinking, as you're thinking about policy, if policy and legislation was done every year, there would be no legislators, right? Because there's always a new law to be passed. There's always some new initiative that's going on, and that I think is the same for us. That there's always something that's changing, and even if you fix one thing, there's something else coming, and what's the next thing? So that's a good lead in, I think, to where, when dual enrollment was opened up, and certainly at LCCC, we saw a huge influx of students. That was great. Okay, but now what? What we want to get these other students in that are not participating. Okay, so we can do this innovative waiver, and we can admit them to an early college, high school, that they don't have these certain admission requirements. That's great. But now they're just taking a bunch of classes that don't mean anything. So now what? Now we have to figure out, okay, how do we get them taking courses, get students thinking about what is a great major, when they're 14 years old. Of course, they can all know their college major as their high school freshman, right? But working with an academic advisor early on, having students declare a major or even a path of interest within those first 12 credit hours, or certainly by 24, connecting them with an academic advisor in that program and career pathway, and sitting down and making sure they have some sort of plan. In Ohio, there's a statewide transfer system that we see many of our dual enrollment students doing, because it's those general education courses that are guaranteed then to transfer to all of our public institutions. But even that's not enough, right? Because now we'd like them to look at those transfer programs and courses within a specific major. And so can we get them thinking about that earlier, connecting them with that advisor, so that they are able to really plan out and not just, take the dual enrollment courses for dual enrollment course sake, right? So that is something that actually we're focusing on at LCCC right now. It's a huge part with it's an advising initiative. LCCC revamped our advising program several years ago, and we're doing it again. And we're including our dual enrollment students forefront this time, because they're 40% of our college's population. And that's the reality for many schools as well, that this is a growing part of our schools, and we need to make sure that they're on track as well.
This is great. I'm gonna shift our conversation a little bit, and then I see other questions are coming in the chat. We're going to make sure we spend a little bit of time on those as well. Appreciate them as we go, and we'll incorporate them into the flow as well. But I do want to turn the conversation to implications of dual enrollment's growth. And Tim, I'm going to tee you up here first, but you kind of like look over the horizon here, and it's not only growing, but it also seems to be like a major engine of sustaining enrollments in community colleges, especially post-pandemic, right? You hear anecdotes about 50% of the community college is actually high school students, in some sites. And I just wondered whether or not this trend seems significant to you. How do you see the education system evolving, if at all, because of dual enrollment? And if we're going to be more proactive than reactive in policy, what might that look like?
Thanks, Joel. I'm going to try to tie, because I was just itching on that last topic to jump in. And so I'm going to try to tie the two together, because one of the things I've been especially interested in since I started here at OSPI 2 years ago is generating a heat map of where we have dual credit being offered and where we have dual credit deserts. And I think this brings us to your follow-up question, but to the question of equity, I think oftentimes one of the things that we're missing is the capacity of the schools that serve low-income students, students with disabilities, migrant students, homeless students. I mean, these are oftentimes your least resourced schools in the first place, or their resources are stretched thin because of the student populations they're serving. Dual credit isn't necessarily the first thing on their minds, nor the first thing that they have opportunity to address. So I think as we talk about equity, we also have to look at not only policy, but the way that we're driving the funding to the schools. Because we, as I said, in Washington have addressed most of, I don't want to toot our horn too much, but we've addressed most of the economic barriers to student access to dual credit. And yet we're still seeing, like everybody else, major gaps among demographic groups and special populations, anywhere from 6 to 12% on demographic groups. We've got a 15% gap in participation among low income students, even though they are essentially fully subsidized for any one of our dual credit programs. So funding subsidizing the student experience is not the answer. There's clearly issues of perception, and there's issues, as we've tapped into, of guidance. But I think there's a systemic issue with how we are driving funding to the schools doing the work. And so pivoting to your next question, I think one of the trends is that, at least in Washington, we're robbing Peter to pay Paul. So I've really touted how we are supporting students and making these opportunities by and large free to them, but we're doing that by moving the students' basic education funding from the high schools to the colleges. So in the case of Running Start, a student who participates in a course at the college loses 93% of that student's prorated BEA, basic education allocation, to the college. That doesn't set up the districts for looking too kindly upon that program when they're still doing a lot of the work to facilitate, if not the instruction, of course, they're still doing the administrative work to get those students enrolled, to counsel them appropriately, to do the forms and the paperwork required, and they're losing funding in the process. So we, looking beyond, we're trying to address some of those issues proactively, about talking about whether that split's really appropriate, about looking, for me, as somebody who manages a fairly decent sized grant program, I'm trying to develop a formulaic way of identifying those deserts I was talking about and driving funding into oftentimes rural communities, driving funding towards student schools that are supporting underrepresented students, because again, even when it comes to grant funding, which is widely available here in Washington, the schools that need it the most don't have capacity to do it. They don't have grant writers. Your wealthiest schools are the ones that have professional grant writers and the people who are attuned to these opportunities. So I've been looking into approaching it more formulaically in terms of looking at data and making data-informed decisions on how we use our money, where it goes, and for what purposes. Some other things that we've been looking at is a dual credit enrollment platform, something that is going to tie our two systems together and create an easily streamlined process for students to manage. But ultimately, you asked about what's to come. I think one of the big things that we need to start looking at is how we're messaging the importance of dual credit, because it's not just an advantage for the student. It's an advantage for our workforce, for our communities. It's a fiscal advantage for the financial health of those communities. And so when we're talking about promoting dual credit, seeking more opportunities to expand and engage in dual credit, there are so many opportunities that it presents beyond the experience of one student. This student is going to get some credits, it's going to help them along a path. No, this program holistically is going to drive students into our colleges, to your point, to boost enrollments. They're going to get students out of our colleges quicker, and with less debt, and make them more valuable contributors to the workforce. So I think as we start to continue to massage our messaging, we have to address that. I also think we have to start looking at what opportunities are there for these students as they accelerate their academic plans. We have students here in Washington, what we're starting to come up against is students who are graduating early. What kind of opportunities can we develop them at the K-12 or post-secondary level that accounts for that? That's looking into gap years, community service options, opportunities for more elective credits that may clarify their career path. Again, they're earning credentials and degrees much more quickly. Are those driving them into advanced degrees? If not, what can we be doing to encourage that? And so I just think there's a lot, and I'm kind of up at the 10,000-foot view here, but there's a lot going on as a consequence of dual credit. I don't think we've started to really process from a messaging standpoint and from a future, I don't know, a futuristic perspective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, really appreciate that. Really appreciate that. Alex, I'm going to turn to you next about what you're seeing in forecasting about how dual enrollment is evolving education systems, and is it something policy should keep an eye on shaping, and how?
It absolutely should, right? I think, Nadia's point, 40% of Lorain County Community Colleges enrollment comes from high school students. That's not unusual, right? There's some colleges where more than 50% of their enrollments come from high school students. The number of students who in Indiana who take a dual credit course before graduating high school is 60%, right? The number in Kentucky and in Colorado is in the mid-40s. There are lots of students taking college courses while they're in high school. This is not some niche thing for a few students anymore. We all know that, but I don't know that sort of the policy systems have woken up to the reality of our education system, which is that there has been a significant shift in the experiences of students and how they're processing this. Not for enough students. There are still obviously huge equity gaps to close, but there are lots of students taking lots of college courses in high school. And I think it's really incumbent on ourselves to sort of ask the question, and this is a little bit the sort of discussion that's happening in the chat too, like, where do we stop, right? Like, what is the appropriate role of this? Because if you chart the current growth projections and you continue them out, you're reaching a point where you're looking at really significant shifts in the current education system, right? So like, if 60% of students are taking a college course by the time they complete high school, what happens when we get to 100%? What happens when we get to 100% of students taking 1 year's worth of dual enrollment courses when they get to high school, right? Like, we've created a completely different post-secondary education system, one in which students are graduating high school, going to college. If they're going to a 2-year college, guess what? It's not a 2-year college anymore. It's a 1-year college because they've already got 1 year of college credit under their belt. If they're going to a 4-year college, guess what? It's not a 4-year college anymore. It's a 3-year college where they start discipline-specific coursework from the moment they arrive. What have we created? We've created the United Kingdom system of higher education. Do we want that, right? Like, I think that's a really important question, like, there is this really important question to ask. As absurd as that sounds on the face of it, this is growing. It's growing really fast, and there are loads of students taking it. And so I think as a field, and as we process this through the question of policy, I think we have to get much clearer about what we want this to be, right? What is the stable state for dual enrollment? Is it lots of students taking lots of courses? Is it lots of students taking some courses where they have intensive set of support services that help them get to a certain threshold of credits that like sets them up for a certain degree of college access and success? Or are we looking for every student to graduate with an associate's degree, right? Like, I think these are really key questions for the field as a whole to grapple with, because the policy implications of those three systems are really different. And the implications for our secondary and post-secondary systems as a whole are really different. And that's before we even get to some of the more revolutionary ideas that have been sort of proposed over the last year. Joel, I'm looking at you, author of The Big Blur, that, sort of call for even more radical rethinking and visioning of the way that we conceptualize these experiences for young people. So I think we're in this really important time where, like, we have this thing, we know it works really well, we know we're in a state where lots is happening and there are lots of decisions that need to get made. And I think it's really important for us to start having that really critical conversation about, like, What is it we're ultimately trying to accomplish here for any given student in any given high school at any given time? And what does that then mean in terms of policy implications and systematic implications for both K-12 and higher education?
I appreciate that. And Tim, go ahead. Yep.
I'm sorry, Joel. I just want to make a quick point or a plea. I mean, to all the chatter that's going on in the chat, and everything that Alex is saying, I think it's so critical that everybody here do their best to engage in the legislative process. Because again, what I'm hearing in the chat is folks are asking, who's going to do this work? If we're talking about free participation orientations, we've got too much on our plates at this level or this level, and who's going to do that work? So ensuring that the funding is driven to the places where it's needed and to advocate for that legislatively or otherwise, I think is critical. So availing yourself of the opportunity to provide public comment, to engage with legislators, call your own. What I have found in my short time is that legislators don't often know the realities of the field, and they don't often know the implications of what they're doing. They want to see something accomplished, and they use policy as a blanket to do that, but they're not thinking about the toll that it takes. And I work at a state agency, so I have that opportunity to try to advocate on behalf of schools and districts, but I'll be honest, they don't always care to hear from me. They want to hear from their constituents. They want to hear from the people impacted, and particularly they want to hear from the students and the families. So where you are working in the field and have access to those students and families, I really just encourage you to engage with them and get them on the docket when these policies are being considered, because that is really where critical decisions are made, and we always feel like something is being done to us. I say it all the time. I'm like, they did it to me again, as opposed to driving the conversation and informing it on the front end.
Great. Thank you for jumping in there. Okay, I'm going to try to do a couple things at once. I mean, we're about 4 minutes away from needing to wrap here. That went really fast, which I thought would happen. I also want to reiterate a point that I think all of you have made here. We're at an inflection point with this stuff, right? And at that point, we ought to really take stock of the research and outcomes to the degree we have data to take steps towards designing the system that we need to accomplish the aims that we want with this tool, right? And I think we've only, if you just do more of it and just continue to do more of it, I think that's going to end up with not necessarily the outcomes that we want, especially equitable outcomes. So that's just one thing I want to reiterate, whether it's the big blur or otherwise, we need to get more intentional about this. It does feel pretty urgent given its growth. I want to give each of you just 1 minute to offer a closing remark, and it could address, because there's a rich chat going on. Nadia, you've been great about answering in real time, but whether you want to address something in there or just a closing comment, why don't we close out with that? So Nadia, why don't I let you go first?
Sure. I feel like you read my notes that are on my screen over here, because I have collect data, reevaluate, improve. I mean, in my opinion, dual enrollment is not going anywhere. It is going to continue on, and I think we do have to get the data, look and see what's going on. It's not set in stone. Figure out what has worked, what hasn't, and what are those next steps, because there's always going to be something coming down. But we all have job security, so there's that. There's my ending comment. We're in it for a lifetime, guys.
Tim and then Alex.
Yeah, I think Nadia's point is well taken. I mean, data is so critical. We always talk about making data-informed decisions. For me, like I said, one of the biggest priorities is identifying where the work is happening and where it's not, and driving resources to those dual credit deserts. But as Nadia was mentioning, I think we we have to have the data to demonstrate return on investment for these programs. And if it's not there, then we need to evaluate why. And we need to do some more root cause analysis of inequities among students and among schools and programs, right? And identify, why isn't this working for this population? And that's not going to come just from your student information systems. You can't just identify there's a gap here and tout it. You have to actually then dig in. And so another thing that I'm considering with funding out of my office is looking at a consultant or a researcher who can come in, and it might be from one of the colleges, right, to demonstrate great partnership, who can go out and identify what, do some stakeholder engagement with folks, do some roundtables and community engagement to find out what those barriers are. Because I think we need to get beyond just saying there's an equity gap and saying, because that translates to, well, you need more money. Okay, here. More money isn't the answer unless it's going to the right things. And when you're talking about policy, unless there's a stipulation that it goes to one thing or another. And so if that thing is capacity at the local level, is resources, is personnel, then that needs to be called out, and we need to have the data to sort of raise that up and elevate what it is that we need to see done to make the program successful, to make the credits transferable, to make it all tick. Because if we're not doing that, we are engaging, as we all talk about, in credit for credit's sake, and that's not helpful.
Yep. Thanks,
And I'll
Tim.
just-
Alex, you get the last word.
I'm going to close with a plug. If this sort of final discussion that we've had around the sort of big vision for like, where are we going and what does this mean for dual enrollment has interested you in any way, at the College and High School Alliance, we published a paper last October called The Next Phase of Dual Enrollment Policy that dives into these questions in much more detail around that vision conversation we were talking about the role of equity moving forward and about intentional dual enrollment moving forward. There are 3 state level recommendations. Those are the 3. And then there are 3 national recommendations around cleaning up our use of language in this space, raising our expectations about what kind of programs should be getting support from the policy environment, and continuing to be really responsive to some of these new issues and conversations that are coming online. They're going to have a big impact on this field moving forward. So if you enjoyed the 50 minutes of this, there's much more available that dives deeper in that paper and resource. And I would hope folks would check it out.
Thank you all. Virtual applause for all of our panelists here. And I just thank everyone for their active engagement and for your support of this movement. We're at a critical point, so really need all you champions out there. Thanks so much. Pleasure to be here. Thanks to our conference organizers. Emily, I think I turn it back over to you.
Thank you all for a wonderful panel. I'm going to go ahead and close this out so that everyone can get to their next sessions, but truly appreciate your time and the conversation in the chat, and I look forward to seeing you all again soon.